Hi there, it's Lerald, and today I'm going to go over everything you need to know to get started with World of Warcraft Classic, specifically when it comes to selecting your first character's class, spec, faction, and race. First and foremost, I realize that Live WoW and Classic WoW are very different games, so unlike my usual guides in which I try to just give you the exact facts on how to spec everything the right way, do the most damage, and play everything by the numbers, I'll be trying my best to cover everything while also answering the question, how serious do you want to be? Are you wanting to be a super serious classic raider? Are you just wanting to level a character on your own pace, maybe do some dungeons, and see what this old game was all about for the first time? Maybe you played back in the day and you just want to take a fun trip down nostalgia lane. So whatever approach you're looking to take, I want to give you the information you'll need to have the best time you possibly can as you take a trip back in time in Azeroth. Before jumping into comparing the Horde and Alliance and going over the classes, I just want to focus on some of the basic differences in Classic WoW as opposed to BFA and recent expansions. First and foremost, this game is not balanced at all like WoW is now. Before anyone gets angry in the comments section and says, yeah, it wasn't homogenized yet. That's true, but this isn't an attack on Classic WoW. I like it. I can't wait to play it. But the developers of vanilla World of Warcraft simply weren't focused on balancing damage, healing, and utility across classes, and especially across specs like they are now. And that was very representative of RPGs of that era in general. Hybrid classes had an immense tax on their utility, and here's an example. A top tier Feral Druid right now may do, say, 5 to 10% less damage than an equally skilled player of a more popular spec. In Classic WoW, a good warrior or rogue can easily do more than twice as much damage as a comparably skilled and geared Feral Druid in a raid setting. This brings me to another weird quirk of Classic WoW, mana management. While health works mostly the same, aside from warriors and rogues having to eat food and use bandages all the time, mana is very different. By default, casting a spell that costs mana causes your mana regeneration to stop for 5 seconds. This is usually referred to as the 5-second rule. For healers, downranking spells is an important part of managing your mana. That's why vanilla druids, for example, would usually just chain cast rank 4 healing touch despite the spell having 10 ranks in total. It's much more efficient to just cast rank 4 over and over, and only use higher ranks or other spells in case of emergencies. It's very common for healers to have their bars dedicated to a bunch of different ranks of the same spells as a way to fine-tune their mana usage. It's weird. Now here's where it gets weirder. Managing mana is an important part of your gameplay for damage dealers too, with the obvious exceptions of warriors, rogues, and feral druids who don't have mana. For leveling or grinding mobs out in the world, managing your mana as a DPS class usually just boils down to drinking in between kills. In dungeons and raids, it usually means only using your most efficient single-target spells, and using mana regeneration consumables, talents, and in some cases, even mana regen on gear. For specs like Ret Paladin and Enhancement Shaman, it makes them a lot less viable in terms of their ability to do damage in raids. They can start out a fight by doing a lot of burst damage, and that totally works in PvP, but against a raid or dungeon boss, they run out of mana and just wind up auto-attacking, and that's not great. On the subject of health and mana, leveling is much harder in Classic than on Live. I think going from 110 to 120 took us 10 to 12 hours on BFA release, and we were going at a nice leisurely pace with plenty of breaks. Classic leveling will take an absolute minimum of 5 days of /played time, and that's if you're really serious. That's at least 120 hours. 120 is a lot more than 10. Also on the subject of mana management, enemies in Classic WoW only have 16 debuff slots available. As a result, this means that classes that can load an enemy up with debuffs, such as Affliction, Warlocks, Feral Cat Druids, and so on, can't do that in raids. In dungeons, there is more likely to be enough debuff space to go around, but generally in PvE, debuff-based damage is not valuable. Even though that playstyle is generally mana efficient, it's just not usable in group PvE because of the debuff limit. In PvP, dots are awesome, or very annoying if you're on the receiving end. Classic WoW will be releasing in 6 phases, slowly unlocking more in-game content to the players over time. We're not sure exactly how long that's going to take, but what we do know is that on release, Classic WoW's in-game will consist of Molten Core and Onyxia. The tools that players will have in Classic are very different, but I did a Ragefire Chasm on live servers the other day on a fresh level 20 mage just to look at the mechanics, and in RFC I saw mechanics such as a boss that charges at players and you have to sidestep it, a breath mechanic that had to be pointed away from the party by the tank, and swirly circles on the ground that you have to move out of before they explode. Again, this isn't a dig on Classic WoW, but that level 20 dungeon was a good bit more complicated than Classic Molten Core or Onyxia, which basically just consisted of auto attack or shadow bolt the boss to death before it auto attacks the raid to death. Now sure, part of why those simpler mechanics were so much more challenging way back in vanilla WoW is that we weren't as good at the game then, but that's not all. In Classic, DPS tanking and healing toolkits are way more focused around single target than they are AoE. While there are a handful of AoE damage skills and multi-target heals, they are much less complex than they are in live WoW. Here's an example. For DPS Warrior AoE, you cast Whirlwind every 10 seconds, and you otherwise just continue your single target DPS rotation as normal. For Frostmage AoE, you channel Blizzard until everything's dead. That's it. It's not exactly super complicated. One of the things that vanilla WoW enthusiasts have repeatedly praised about the game over the last decade is how complex it is. Obviously they aren't talking about DPS rotations in which you press Frostbolt from the moment a boss is pulled until it dies, or the simple fight mechanics, so what do they mean? Unlike the past several expansions of live WoW, Classic has an incredibly complex collection of out-of-combat buffs and bonuses, ranging from alchemy flasks, potions and elixirs, gatherable consumables, engineering bombs and trinkets, enchants, and class buffs. If gems, enchants, potions, and flasks are worth around 3% of your total DPS healing and tankiness in BFA, in Classic those bonuses are probably closer to 30% or more of your total damage, healing, and tankiness. So it's a game with a fairly simple combat system, but much more complicated and much more rewarding out-of-combat systems. On the subject of professions, engineering is the absolute strongest one by far. It's the most expensive to level and make work, but for increasing your DPS, threat, tankiness, and your power in PvP, it's the best one. It's also the only one that creates BOP items that boost your strength. Alchemy, enchanting, blacksmithing, and tailoring, and the rest are all good professions, there's a value in each of them, but engineering is the one that increases your character's power the most. And finally, my last note here before moving on to Alliance vs Horde, making gold in Classic WoW is hard. The lack of daily quests and world quests mean that there is way less gold injected into the game through quest systems. Virtually all of the gold on a server comes from one of three sources: killing mobs and looting them, which is not efficient, but definitely something you'll be doing, completing quests at level 60, and vendoring items. The game also siphons a much higher proportion of gold out of the economy in the form of repair bills, respec costs, food and water costs, and so on. As a result, gathering professions are really helpful in getting enough gold to afford your base mount skill at level 40, and that's a huge boost to your leveling speed when the going starts to get tough. So when it comes to starting out with gathering professions, take one. In fact, take two if you're really serious. Now, two quick, actual final notes. You can't track herb nodes and mining nodes at the same time, so if you do take two gathering professions, go with skinning as one of them. Or go with enchanting, which is a totally underrated gathering profession. It's my favorite gathering profession because you don't have to run around mining stupid ore nodes one tedious click at a time, and it's also a crafting profession. You just destroy items and bam, you're making mats, and selling mats makes money. It is definitely a slower moneymaker early on than the other three options, but it's got better long-term viability. I love it, but there are no enchant vellums in Classic, so be warned that if you do want to use enchanting to sell enchants to other players, you'll have to advertise in trade chat and talk to strangers. So yeah, enchanting is great, but you'll have to hustle to make it really work. Alright, let's move on. Before you choose your class and your race, you obviously have to choose your faction. Unless you're playing with a group that's already made that decision for you, it's a pretty important choice with good options on either side. As a lifelong member of the Horde, I'm naturally biased to say go Horde or go home, but as much as it hurts me on the inside to admit it, the Alliance is really good. Just to run through the reasons why the Alliance is good, let's just start with their faction-specific class, Paladin. Paladins rule. Blessings and auras are amazingly powerful. Holding threat is an important and much more challenging part of tanking in Classic, and it's a lot easier for the Alliance thanks to Blessing of Salvation. On top of that, Blessing of Kings is the single strongest buff in the entire game. Any good raid will have a ton of Paladins, and they're one of the best classes to bring to dungeons as well. In terms of racials, humans are, without question, the best Alliance race. +5 skill to one-handed and two-handed maces and swords makes them the strongest race for DPS, and tank warriors and pallies, as well as combat rogues. Weapon skill drastically reduces the amount of hit you need to reach the cap against bosses in dungeons and raids, dropping from 9% all the way down to 6%. Hit is incredibly hard to find in Classic, so gaining 3% hit just from your racial bonus is amazing. Weapon skill also reduces the chance of your auto attacks to glance, which greatly reduces their damage. Weapon skill is crucial for melee classes. An extra 10% to all rep gains is also very nice, considering Classic WoW's rep grinds are brutal. The spirit increase is also fine for casters, and the stealth detection skill is very nice for spotting those dastardly rogues in PvP. Dwarves are pretty decent. Stoneform is a nice defensive cooldown that can counter rogues in PvP extremely well, and Dwarf Priests are amazingly strong thanks to Fear Ward. Being able to cancel out fear effects in raid is extremely strong, and any serious Alliance raid group will have several Dwarf Priests in it for exactly this reason. Gun skill only affects hunters, and unlike sword and mace skill, it's not a humongous increase to your damage. Their other two racial skills just really aren't a big deal at all. Next up are Night Elves, and as far as races that look good, they're basically the only one that still holds up. Shadow Meld is okay, although you can only use it while out of combat, so it's not nearly as powerful as it is on live servers. The dodge chance is fine, but again, not a huge deal, and neither are the other two racials. One quick note before moving on, the Night Elf Hunter Cat combo is a classic PvP setup for a good reason. Both the Hunter and the Cat can go invisible while defending a flag in a battleground, or just hanging out in the world, then ambush unsuspecting Horde out of nowhere. It's pretty cheesy. And last up, it's Gnomes. Escape Artist is one of the best PvP racials in the game, and Gnome warriors can be pretty tough to stop. They also make great mages and warlocks thanks to Expansive Mind. 5% intelligence helps a bit with mana problems, and in Classic, every tiny bonus counts. Finally, engineering specialization is a nice bonus to an already insanely powerful profession. It just helps with leveling, but still it's pretty rad. Now let's move on to the Horde. Horde is the better faction. It's also the uglier faction. Although ugly in Classic is definitely on a sliding scale. Everyone's ugly, we're just talking about shades of extremely ugly gray at this point. Horde racials are also much better suited toward PvP than those of the Alliance. Now let's get to the Horde's faction-specific class, Shaman. Shaman are similar to Pallies in that they are extremely valuable to have around, and the buffs that they provide are absolutely game-changing. Wind Fury Totem is the best DPS increase in the entire game, and as a result, Horde are capable of higher DPS than the Alliance. This means that the threat requirements for Horde tanks and raids and dungeons are even higher than those of Alliance tanks, and that's before including the awesome and unique power of Blessing of Salvation. On top of that, Shaman are great at interrupting and slowing enemies. They can offensively dispel, and they can add an exceptional amount of group utility. They're insanely aggressive in PvP, and they're just a really good class to have around. I always love having a Shaman in my group. Now let's go over the Horde racials, starting with the big greenies. Orcs are amazing in PvP for every single class, and they are the Horde's best DPS warriors as well. They have Blood Fury, which is a great DPS cooldown that significantly increases your melee DPS at the expense of applying a Mortal Strike effect for 25 seconds. It's worth noting that Blood Fury does not count for spell damage or ranged physical attacks, just melee DPS. So too bad, Hunters and Warlocks. This is obviously an amazing bonus for damage dealers and in one-on-one PvP, but it's super dangerous for tanking and organized PvP with healers. Orcs also have Hardiness, which grants a 25% increased chance to resist stuns, added onto the base 5% chance to resist stuns that gives orcs a 30% chance to resist stuns. PvP in vanilla is much faster than it is on live servers, and you can easily die in the span of a 6-second stun. The ability to resist a rogue's kidney shot and turn and smash their face into a million pieces makes orcs monsters in PvP, and they can absolutely destroy Alliance rogues, paladins, and warriors. Unfortunately, this doesn't apply to many of the stuns in dungeons and raids. While most raid bosses don't have stuns, a lot of dungeon and raid trash does, and it's fairly annoying. But some of those stuns just can't be resisted. Orcs also have Axe Specialization, which is roughly equivalent to the bonus that humans get to swords and maces. Again, unfortunately, axes are a lot less well suited for being tanking weapons than swords or maces. There are basically only a handful of high-level axes that are good for tanks, and virtually all of the other desirable tanking weapons are daggers or swords. So yeah, Orcs an okay tank race, but not a great one. It's a shame, but orcs are so good at doing melee damage and anything related to PvP that it really makes up for it. Also, I almost skipped over the pet damage increase. Pet damage in Classic is a very small percentage of your total damage, and pets die pretty often in raids and dungeons, and PvP for that matter. It's not a big bonus even when it's working. Moving right down the list, Undead are also really strong in PvP. Will of the Forsaken can help quickly break out of a fear and turn the tables on Alliance warlocks and priests. It's also useful in a decent number of boss fights since fear is a reasonably common effect. Undead are an okay race in PvE as a result, but generally not as good as Orc or Troll. That's about it. Cannibalizes free food every 2 minutes, underwater breathing and shadow resist are fine, the race looks good, meh. Tauren are next. Orc Stomp is, I believe, the only AoE stun in the game, and it's great in dungeons and in PvP. The 5% increase to total health is also fairly nice. It gets better as the expansion goes on since it's based on total health, and not just a base health buff like in BFA. So early on in Phase 1 of Classic WoW, it's only going to be worth a couple of hundred health at best. But as the game progresses, more content is unlocked and your health pool continues to grow, your health value is going to grow even faster than everyone else's. Another really appealing aspect of Tauren is that they have a larger hitbox than every other race, and Blizzard has officially confirmed that this is an intended effect. This means that Tauren get into melee range with mobs slightly quicker than other races, and that actually has a meaningful effect on threat. Without going into too much detail here, in WoW to pull threat you have to generate more threat than the person who currently has threat. The amount you need is only 110% in melee and 140% at range. As a result, Tauren's larger hitbox means they'll get into melee range of enemies ever so slightly quicker, and thus establish initial threat slightly faster than any other race, and if a player at range does manage to pull threat, Tauren can get back into melee range with the mob that's running away just slightly quicker than any other race, and since Taunt is a melee range skill in Classic, you'll need to get into melee range to regain threat. It's a tiny gain in PvE, but it is something? In PvP, extra melee range is a humongous bonus, and Alliance players will have a much tougher time running away from a giant bloodthirsty, angry Tauren than they will any other race. Oh yeah, herbalism skill and nature resist, whatever. And finally we have Trolls, the race that arguably has the best racial in the game, and definitely has the worst racial in the game. Regeneration spawned the "I'm regenerating 5 HP per second and there's nothing you can do about it" meme, which is definitely one of the better jokes that come out of vanilla. On the other hand, you get Berserking, which is an absolutely amazing increase to attack and casting speed. You only have to be below 40% health to get the full 30% attack speed increase, and that's easily doable as a tank. As a result, trolls are generally considered the best protection warriors for generating threat in raids. End of discussion. But wait, let's not end that discussion, because what about in dungeons? 3 minutes is kind of a long cooldown for a 10-second effect, so while berserking can probably be up for every boss, it's not really that usable on most trash packs. Now, to be fair, bosses are where threat really matters most. If a random mob turns and whacks a rogue, it may not die, whereas if a boss turns around and whacks a rogue, it probably will. As for mages, shaman, and hunters, trolls are the best DPS race for them on the horde, although for shadow priests you are better off going undead. Like gun specialization on dwarves, bow specialization isn't quite as valuable for hunters as sword and axe specialization are for warriors and rogues, but it's still a pretty good bonus, and again, berserking totally rocks. The 5% increase to damage dealt to beasts only applies to Magmadar in Molten Core, Mixna in Naxxramas, and a handful of bosses Phase 2 forms in Zul'Gurub, but it's great to have while leveling or skinning or whatever. Troll is the Horde's one really good PvE race. They make excellent healing priests and resto shaman as well. So now let's move on to classes, and let me start by touching on my preferred role on live servers, tanking. Protection Warrior is the default tank in Classic WoW. I could pretty much just end this section right there, but I do want to lay out why they are considered the gold standard. In Classic WoW, threat is a major issue. Boss mobs are immune to taunt, so the number one thing that limits a group's ability to deal damage is the tank's ability to generate threat. Threat really isn't any more complicated than dealing damage as a tank in live WoW. In fact, it's simpler to manage since threat generation basically boils down to maximizing your usage rates on 4 skills: Heroic Strike, Sunder Armor, Shield Slam, and Revenge. So how does this relate to the other classes? Well, Druids and Paladins simply can't generate as much single target threat as a warrior. They also don't have the same quality of defensive cooldowns, and most importantly, they don't have shield block. Shield block, just like on live WoW, is the defensive engine that keeps Warrior going. It helps smooth out your damage intake and is a crucial defensive advantage that Warriors have over the other 2 tanks. So bottom line, if you want to be the best tank you can be, play Warrior. That being said, if you want to play a tank that's quirky or off meta, there is hope. Classic WoW isn't that difficult, and just because Druid and Paladin aren't the standard specs doesn't mean you can't play them. It's just about setting the right level of expectation before going in. Will you be able to tank Molten Core as a Bear Druid? Totally. A Shadow Priest did it in vanilla. Yeah, a Shadow Priest. That being said, if you choose to play a Paladin or Druid with the expectation of tanking, you will probably have a harder time finding groups willing to bring you along, so keep that in mind if you're looking to be super serious. If you're just looking to have some fun, go for it. On a positive note, both Bear and Paladin arguably have better AoE threat than Warrior, and they can be pretty decent off tanks. Before I move on to DPS, let me just quickly say, Shaman tanking? I have heard that Blizzard's initial plan with Shaman was to make enhancement a tanking spec, but they scrapped that before the game ever went live. They have 2 skills that generate extra threat, Rockbiter Weapon and Earthshock, so that does seem like it was probably part of a plan to make them tanks. And honestly, Shaman can do a half-decent job of tanking dungeons at lower levels. I tanked plenty of Ragefire Chasm and Wailing Caverns runs on a Shaman back in the day, and it's definitely doable. Once you get to dungeons around level 30 to 40 or so, mobs start hitting too hard for your relatively low armor, and holding threat becomes pretty tough. So I wouldn't recommend trying it as anything other than a fun, weird little novelty that you can do while you're at low levels. Alright, on to everything else. One thing to realize about DPS is that for the most part, each class really only has one competitive DPS spec. There are a few exceptions, such as the Deep Frost Mage that sacrifices a bunch of personal DPS to buff all of the other Arcane Frost Mages in the group by 10%, but basically only Mage, Warlock, and Rogue are able to play multiple competitive DPS specs. So here's the super quick version if you're just looking to be a DPS god in Phase 1 of Classic WoW. The best melee DPS class is Fury Warrior, and the best range DPS is Frost Mage. It's a common misconception that Fury Warrior takes some gear to ramp up to being the best, and while there is some truth in that, there is enough gear just in the Phase 1 content of Classic WoW for Fury Warriors to hit that point where they jump out to number 1. Good Fury Warriors can pull ahead of mages, rogues, and everyone else within the first several weeks to a month of servers being live, and stay there forever. Maybe until they release Burning Crusade servers. Alright, now time for more detail, and let's just go class by class. I already covered tanking for druids, so let's just move on to damage and healing. And when it comes to druids doing damage, it's kind of rough. Balanced Druid is the absolute weakest spec in all of Classic WoW. I'm sorry. It's just so mana efficient to play a Balanced Druid that it's really hard to justify, even as a joke. Spamming Moonfire in PvP is very fun to do, and very annoying to be on the receiving end of, but that's really more of a resto thing. Feral Druid isn't a great DPS, but it does have a decent chunk of utility. They bring a valuable buff and debuff, a combat res, and at a pinch they can make a really decent off-tank or emergency tank if the Protection Warrior goes down. Feral Druids cannot benefit from Wind Fury Totem, so Horde Feral Druids are significantly weaker than Alliance Feral Druids. Resto Druids are also one of the weakest healers. For some reason, Druids don't have a regular res, just their combat res, which means that you'll usually want to have another class who can res in your dungeon groups just to save time. Druids have awesome utility, and you definitely want some of them in your raids, but meh. Also in Classic WoW, you can only have one copy of a heal over time spell on you at once. This means if 2 druids try to cast Rejuve on a single target, only one will apply. The positive of playing a druid is that they are a hybrid. They aren't especially great at healing, tanking, or dealing damage, but they can bring a lot of utility no matter what role they're trying to fill. And they can fill any of the 3 main roles, and that's not bad. They're also uniquely able to do stealth runs with rogues, and that's a great way to farm individual bosses for specific pieces of gear without having to do entire runs of huge dungeons like Blackrock Depths, for example. As one last note, Feral Druids, and Resto Druids to a pretty decent extent, are amazing flag runners in Warsong Gulch. They're crazy mobile, they're almost impossible to catch, they can stealth root, heal, never stop running, never ever stop running, and they're just really frustrating to deal with. It's a great class for organized PvP, although there won't be any organized PvP in Phase 1 at all, and Warsong Gulch specifically won't be added to the game until Phase 3. Also, one more actual final note, druids can gather herbs while in travel form, just like on live servers. This makes them a great gold-making class as herbalists, just like on live servers. Alright, now it's time for Hunter, the first of the 4 pure DPS classes. They're probably the weakest of the 4 in terms of total damage in dungeons and raids, but they have a lot of positives going for them that make up for it. For one, Hunters are straight up mandatory in Molten Core for dispelling Magmadars in Rage with Trank Shot, and for kiting mobs in Blackwing Lair on Razor Gore. Along with Rogues, they are also one of only 2 specs in the game that have a total threat wipe, and Feign Death is only on a 30-second cooldown. They're second to none at kiting, and their ability to kite is extremely valuable both for soloing content that other classes can't, and for kiting dangerous mobs while in dungeons and raids. There are tons of elites scattered around the world in Classic WoW, from Red Dragons to Scarlet Crusade to Silithid Hives to Demons. Hunters and Mages are the 2 best classes at soloing those elites, and they're basically the only 2 classes that really can from the very start of hitting level 60. This gives Hunters a huge advantage for solo farming, which does really help with making gold early on. Hunters are also pretty widely regarded as the easiest class to level. Hunters also have extremely strong CC thanks to traps, which makes them really strong in PvP as well. A good hunter can destroy casters, rogues, and warriors alike in duels and world PvP. The negatives are pretty simple. Classic hunters have a dead zone, and they do have to differentiate between ranged and melee attacks, which can be pretty annoying. They also have to micromanage their pets to keep them alive, and the pet management system is really complicated and not particularly well explained in-game. Also, ammo. Hunters require ammo, and ammo requires a quiver, and a quiver is a bag slot. So hunters automatically lose out on an entire bag slot just for playing the class. Yikes. Mage is up next, and Mage is probably my favorite of all the pure DPS classes for starting out. Mage has the best AoE and single target damage of any range class in Molten Core and Blackwing Lair. They're also the kings of personal utility, by far the most self-sufficient class around. They have great group utility as well. Polymorph is the most reliable CC in the game, they have teleports, portals, conjure food and water, all of which are great. An enterprising mage can make a lot of gold selling portals in Classic WoW, and a lot of friends handing out free food and water. They're also one of the only classes that can reliably AoE farm mobs out in the world, making them one of the 2 best classes for farming gold at level 60 shortly after release. Mages are amazingly powerful in PvP. Classic WoW doesn't have the incredible number of mobility skills that Live WoW does, and that means that mages are way more adept at kiting and keeping melee enemies locked down. Now for the bad news. Frost Mage's single target rotation is basically just Frostbolt. Frostbolt in the morning, Frostbolt at night, Frostbolt all day long. Once you get through Molten Core and Blackwing Lair, you can switch to Fire Mage, and that's nice. But unfortunately, the Fire Mage rotation is mostly just Fireball. Alright, Pally time. Paladin is the class I know least about from personal experience, but I have dabbled in it quite a bit, and here's what I know. They will rock your face and your body in PvP. They will destroy every inch of you. I speak from experience. It happened to me. In PvE, they have mana issues, and as a result, they mostly wind up just auto-attacking on longer fights. It isn't the most engaging playstyle, but that's mostly how Rep Pallies play anyhow. You seal, you judge, you're a paladin. Thanks to auras and blessings, Pallies bring an enormous amount of utility to any group. Ret's not a spec that's in high demand in dungeons and raids, but they are extremely powerful and fun to play out in the world and in PvP. I'm deeply ashamed of enjoying Rep Pally, but I do. As for healing, Holy Pally is great at it, and they're probably the healer with the least mana issues in the entire game, which just by default makes them incredibly powerful. They're also just massively tanky, which is really annoying to deal with in PvP. So yeah, just like druids, Pallies are a great class if you're looking to do a little bit of everything, or be a super utility machine, but they're definitely better as healers than they are tanks or DPS. Priest is up next, and as the old saying goes, Shadow Priests melt faces in PvP. Seriously, they do. Outside of PvP, Shadow Priests are decent damage dealers, but not on the level of Mage or Warlock. As a result, they're in pretty low demand in raids and dungeons, and you will probably be asked to heal most of the time you try to play in raids and dungeons. And that's understandably annoying if all you want to do is melt faces. As for healing, priests are more or less on the level of warrior tanks. Holy Pallies do a good job, but holy priests are the gold standard of healing, hands down. Disciplined priests are also super viable, sacrificing some total healing to provide a more utility-oriented spec that can give a party member a massive DPS cooldown. Healing priests have Prayer of Healing, which is an incredibly powerful group heal. They have Greater Heal, which is the strongest single target heal in the game. They're just superhuman healing machines. As for downsides, Holy and Disciplined priests are pretty squishy, and Druid, Pally, and even Shaman are all generally more powerful as healers in PvP because they have better tools for escaping from rogues and warriors. Rogues are the sneaky killing machines of Classic WoW, and if you're playing on a PvP server, they're going to give you nightmares. Unless you're the one giving other people nightmares. Even then, you'll probably have nightmares of rogues. Rogues are the unquestioned gods of one-on-one PvP, and can easily kill other players within a stun lock window, taking them from 100 to 0 without ever giving them a single chance to respond. In PvE, combat rogues are an extremely strong DPS class. You can even sell lockpicking services in towns as a rogue for a decent profit. Rogues just don't have any downsides. And now here are the downsides: everyone and their mama plays rogue. Seriously, there's too many of them. They're coming out of the walls. So given that the supply of rogues is so high, it can be tougher to find groups as one than on a class that provides more utility, like a shaman, paladin, or druid. Also, rogues require a lot of reagents, most of which come from vendors or herbalism. It's not prohibitively expensive, but it adds up over time, and it does kind of push you into being an herbalist alchemist on rogue, which is a great profession combo to have on anyone, so I guess that's not really a downside. But it is a little bit, because you have to keep reagents in your bag to cast skills like Blind and Vanish, and that's a little annoying. So now it's Shaman's turn. They have amazing utility. I love having a Shaman around. Wind Fury Totem is my jam. Strength of Earth Totem is my jam. They can interrupt with Earth Shock. Grounding Totem is awesome. They're just great. Having a Shaman in your group, much like playing with a Paladin, is an absolute delight. And they are also awesome in PvP. Between Earth Shock, Frost Shock, Purge, Grounding Totem, and Tremor Totem, Shaman are an absolute nightmare for Alliance casters. Now obviously I've mentioned totems, and unlike Palioras and Blessings, Shaman have to cast totems out regularly to buff their allies. Totems give great buffs, but they require a fair amount of effort to maintain, and that level of micromanagement is not for everyone. The biggest issue with Shaman is that they are mana hungry, and that means Enhancement and Elemental really aren't that great in dungeons and raids. They bring awesome utility, which is totally great, but Resto Shaman can bring around the same level of utility and provide solid healing. And then you're not spending a DPS spot on someone whose damage is a little lackluster. Again, like Druid and Paladin, Shaman's a great utility class, and if you're willing to heal and looking to play around with multiple roles, they're an excellent choice. If you're just looking to DPS, you can, but you may find it a little bit tougher to get into groups. Warlocks are another class with strong utility, and like mages, they are extremely good at being self-sufficient. They're excellent damage dealers, and although they will start out behind mages in Phase 1, they become the best range damage dealer by the end phases of Classic. Warlocks bring good group utility in the form of skills like Ritual of Summoning, Banish, Soulstone, Healthstones, and Curses, and they offer a ton of personal utility when on their own too. They're also pretty good AoE damage dealers. Warlocks are one of the classes most heavily affected by the debuff limit, and as a result, dotting up enemies as Affliction is not viable in raids. Afflock in Classic totally rules while leveling. It's one of my favorite leveling specs, and it feels surprisingly modern given how vastly different everything else in the game is, but yeah, you really just can't play like that in a group setting. Kind of a big bummer. As a result, the Warlock rotation in group play mostly just consists of shadow bolting your enemy until they die. Unlike all of the other mana-based classes in the game, Warlock doesn't have to spend as much effort in managing mana thanks to Life Tap. Mana and health are more or less all just one big shared bar, at least until you die. Warlock is an awesome class in PvE if you're looking for a solid caster with a different kind of flavor of utility from Mage. The biggest downsides with Warlock are that you have no real mobility or defensive power aside from a gigantic health pool, so you're just begging to be ripped apart by rogues. Your Succubus can break a stun lock with Seduction, but if a rogue catches you without her active, you're basically already dead. Death Coil, Seduce, and Fear are your setup to land nukes, and because Undead can break out of Seduce and Fear with Will of the Forsaken, this puts Alliance Warlocks at a significant disadvantage. The biggest drawback to Warlocks is the Soul Shard system. Unlike in Live WoW, Soul Shards are a resource that you have to farm, and you will need a lot of them in raids and dungeons to cast powerful spells like Healthstone, Soulstone, and Ritual of Summoning. How do you get them? By channeling Drain Soul on mobs as they die. So unlike every other class that can just log in and join a group and go, a Warlock has to log in, go out, and farm mobs for Soul Shards for a while, then join a group to party or raid. It's inconvenient. Also, like Hunters, Warlocks have dedicated Soul Shard bags, which is helpful because they're huge, but you do have to give up a bag slot. So that's not great. And I've saved the best for last. Warrior. They're the best tanks and the best damage dealers. What can't they do? Heal. That's the answer, and it's also their biggest downside. Warriors are an absolute chore to level on their own. If you can level with someone else, ideally someone who can throw you some heals and buffs along the way like a shaman, pally, or priest, it gets a lot less horrible. Similarly, unlike Mage or Hunter, who can easily solo elites, a warrior really struggles to kill elites on their own out in the world. Basically, unless you are super duper geared, which you probably can't be geared enough in Classic until it's at least several phases in, you will not be able to kill elites on your own. So make friends. In PvP, a well-supported warrior is an absolute monster, an unstoppable killing machine. A warrior on their own without any support is cannon fodder. They're extremely easy to kite and keep locked down. I've seen mages beat warriors using only their wands, just to show off. Another downside to warriors is that they have to deal with stance dancing to make use of their full kit, which can be a little complicated for players who aren't super experienced with the class already. All in all, I think warrior is the best class. It's certainly my favorite class, and I will be playing one, or maybe two. But it's also probably the most complicated and unforgiving class in vanilla, and certainly the biggest pain to level. So it's recap time, and let's get right to it. The Alliance, thanks to their racials and the power of pallies, generally fare a bit better in raids and dungeons than the Horde, whereas the Horde's racials and the strength of Shaman make them somewhat better in PvP. Neither faction is bad at either, but there is a clear advantage in each direction. As for the best class race combos, there are some nice advantages to be gained, but don't feel like you're required to go with a Troll Warrior to tank if you'd really rather play a Tauren or an Orc. I'm still struggling to decide which race I want to play as a warrior right now. It's tearing me up inside. Just as a general rule of thumb, orcs and humans are the two best all-around races for their respective factions. Gnomes and undead are also good in PvP, and trolls are good in PvE. As for classes, warriors are the only top-tier tank, the two best melee damage dealers are warrior and rogue in that order, and the two best range damage dealers are mage and warlock, also in that order, at least during the first couple phases of Classic. And finally for healing, priest is the best, although I'm always happy to see a friendly paladin, shaman, or even a druid, and get some of the nice utility they bring to a group. And now for one final note, Classic WoW really is a very different game from Live WoW, and exploring it and getting a feel for it on your own is really what it's all about. For all the min-maxy info I feel like I've just given you, which is great, it doesn't mean you can't do things differently. Maybe you heard me saying that druids are not competitive tanks with warriors and you thought, I'll bet I can tank a Nixia on a bear druid. I'll bet you're right. Don't let me stop you. Instead, let me encourage you to play Classic WoW to the fullest. Get out there into that new, old world and experience everything it has to offer. Well, I think that about covers everything we need to know for Classic launch. Let me just finish up by saying that I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you're as excited as we are for the release of World of Warcraft Classic. Stay tuned for more videos about Classic and live World of Warcraft, and thanks for watching. Bye!